Good afternoon, my friends. This is Paul, and today I'm going to be reviewing to you Arzette, the Jewel of Faramore for the Nintendo Switch. When most people think of the Philips CDi, probably one of two phrases come to mind. Epic failure, or, oh, that YouTube poop about those really bad Zelda and Mario games. Well, what if I told you that some indie developer thought it would be a good idea to make a spiritual successor to those games with the goal of it actually being good? Well, spoiler alert for the rest of the review, he succeeded. Even though this game came out in 2024, the developer wanted to make it as though it were a long-lost piece of media from the Philips CDi. The level design and hand-drawn environments were done by one of the same guys who worked on the CDi games. The cutscenes are intentionally atrocious with a very distinct art style, and the voice acting is deliberately over the top to really recapture that era where voice direction really wasn't that big of a priority. Speaking of voices, they actually had the gall to hire Jeffrey Rath and Bonnie Jean Wilbur, the original voices of Link and Zelda in the first two CDi games, and they do a magnificent job of sounding forced. Like, it really is a treat to hear what they have to say. Here's just a few snippets of them from early in the game, so no spoilers.
The kingdom of Faramore knew peace for an age, a beautiful, bountiful land. It has been ruled by the royal Rockland family for generations.
Press attack to slash your sword. Hey, you have a smart sword. It interacts with both objects and people. You can crouch by moving down. Moving while crouching lets you duck walk. This old trick gets you into tight spaces.
You got an eye for beauty, don't you?
Jeffrey Rath does make one more cameo, but that would be into spoiler territory, so to give you a hint as to who he plays, it's a character that's parodying a real-life famous person. You'll know it when you see it. The gameplay is pretty much identical to Wand of Gamelon and Faces of Evil as well. It's a side-scrolling Metroidvania platformer where you play as Arzette, who has a sword, the ability to jump, and eventually she learns other abilities, such as being able to use items, including bombs, to blow up holes in cracked surfaces. There's a lantern that lets her see better in the dark as long as she has enough lantern oil, and eventually she just keeps getting more and more abilities in her arsenal so that traversal eventually becomes significantly more fun. The level design on one hand feels like it was ripped straight out of the CDi games, but the responsiveness to the actual platforms and the controls make them quite a lot more fun to traverse. You'll never phase through a platform on one playthrough and then stand on it the next. There are some times where it can be unclear what's a platform and what's not, but most of the time they're telegraphed really well. One cool thing about Arzette's sword is that, just like in the CDi games, you slash enemies with it, but when you slash people, you can talk to them. Which, they actually had a whole tutorial about that in the CDi games, and they still have a tutorial about it here. So it's such a loving parody. Actually, speaking of parodies, this game doesn't actually have a whole lot of tongue-in-cheek meta humor about the CDi games. There are some references, obviously, like you can still do the duck walk, and the game will say, "This old trick." And you might have a few lines here and there where you'll say, "Ah, yes, there's a parallel in one of the games." But for the most part, the writing is standalone on its own. Like, there's only a handful of moments where it's derivative of the games, but it doesn't try to mock them. It doesn't try to say, we have done so much better than these games. It tries to say, you know what, maybe if these games had a better budget, more time, and was made on a system that was actually designed to be a video game system instead of a CD player, these could have been great. And retroactively, I feel like Arzette will probably inspire modders and hackers to take those old games and use the tricks that Arzette used to make those CDi games playable and help people realize that they actually were good games all along, but because they were on the wrong hardware at the wrong time, maybe people just didn't like them because they're objectively bad games. But Arzette is not only fun, but it has a handful of modern conveniences to make it ever so slightly more approachable to modern audiences while not holding your hand too much. For example, there's a casual mode where the enemies will drop hearts to refill your health, and they'll also have less hit points, although you can't switch between casual and normal mode in one playthrough. There's also a quest log to keep track of your side quests. They'll have a check mark saying you already did this side quest, so you don't need to go back to a character. And if you're able to go to a new area to fulfill a side quest, then there will be a red exclamation mark on the world map next to the level so that you know that you need to go there. Unfortunately, Arzette can sometimes not hold your hand enough, as there were a handful of times in the early game where I had no idea where I was supposed to go, and the hints that the villagers gave were extremely vague. Granted, I watched a walkthrough for one of the things and felt really stupid about it because the solution was simply you gotta jump at the right angle, which, okay. And then the other time I just didn't notice where I could bomb something. But then after I saw a YouTuber, I'll shout the YouTuber out, random bystander here, thank you for your stream, he showed me where I should have gone and I said, oh, that'll help me progress. So I could see it rekindling a lot of the old playground discourse that games like Zelda 1 had, where people wouldn't use the internet or magazines, they'd share secrets with each other. And so I feel like if I ever meet someone else who plays Arzette, I could say, oh, did you find that secret in that level? And rekindle some of that fun that I had with discovering how to do things in Tears of the Kingdom. Now, because this is a Metroidvania, the structure can take a little bit of getting used to. You technically have to try to light all of the beacons in the levels that will grant you access to new areas, and you'll have to get a crystal shard from each of the bosses in the area in order to face the final boss. But that's really the only true objectives you have. You can do pretty much everything out of order, and by the time I completed my file, it said I only had 64% of the items, so there are quite significant chunks of the game that you can just skip. I highly recommend that you don't, though, because these extra abilities and extra minigames actually make the game significantly more fun. Although I highly suggest if you have seizure troubles that you avoid these minigames. None of them are necessary for completion. All they get you are rubies, the currency, and a fancy mark on the map screen that says you found it. I purposely haven't shown any of the minigames in this footage for fear of people having seizures, so if you're really curious to see what the Hotel Mario gag is, I suggest you look at screenshots, but not in-motion screenshots. You can find these scrolls in each level that take you to minigames that are parodying various other old games, such as Super Smash Bros. And even Hotel Mario. And these are always a joy to play, and I love the music. Speaking of the music, the soundtrack is also phenomenal. It sounds like it came straight out of the CDi while also being really catchy, and I felt nostalgia for games that I've never even played. I kept thinking as I heard the music, this is the proper revival that these old games deserved. It's a proper revival of the original actors of Link and Zelda, who were probably ridiculed for 30 years for being some of the worst performances in a game starring Nintendo characters, and now they're probably beloved icons, and if they're still voice acting professionally, maybe it'll even help their career. There are two things to keep in mind if you are on the fence of buying Arzette. You really have to be a fan of both Metroidvanias and looking at YouTube videos of the CDi Zelda games in order to really appreciate this. If you are a fan of neither, you are probably not going to enjoy yourself. If you're only a fan of Metroidvanias and don't like the CDi Zelda games, then you could say it's a pretty substandard platformer until you start getting the later abilities. But if you look at it in conjunction with the intentionally awful cutscenes and voice acting, then it's an absolute joy. And it made it worth all the times that I would have to backtrack because I love seeing what crazy cutscene I'd see next, what way would I be able to traverse the environments better, and feeling so satisfied when I'd discover a secret passage. Arzette was frustrating at first when I didn't know what I was doing, but over time I gradually learned to appreciate the game, and eventually it just became a breeze to get from area to area. This is normally about $20 to $30 on the eShop, and there's a physical version if you go on Limited Run's website. And I think yeah, you should check it out. I think it's a great way to support such a unique indie product when you thought that they couldn't come up with any new ideas. And if you really want to support them, you could even purchase a CDi controller on Limited Run's website if you want the true authentic experience. Heck, there's even an option in the options menu to turn on classic controls if you really want to feel awful. So with that, thank you so much for watching. Let me know down in the comment section what you thought of the video. If you have any questions, concerns, comments, I love reading and responding to all of the comments, so please don't be shy in sharing your thoughts. And until the next time, remember to keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless. Bye!
Well, what are you waiting for? Defeat Dimer and have some fun.